Athens, in the 5th century before Christ, was a city that worshipped logic, yet built its laws on cruelty. When a husband died, the widow did not inherit his home, his land, or even her own freedom. She inherited a command. A law older than democracy itself demanded she marry his nearest male relative to keep the bloodline pure, to keep property in men's hands. This is not a tale of love or loyalty. It is the story of a woman forced to lie beside the brother of the man she mourned, all in the name of justice. Chloris of Eleusis sat beside the clay lamp that burned low in her courtyard, its smoke curling through the still air. The house was too quiet now. Her husband's laughter had died weeks ago with the fever that swept through the port. For 10 days, she had done what every Athenian widow must: cut her hair, wear the veil of mourning, keep her head low in the streets. Yet as she placed a bowl of figs upon the family altar, the sound of sandals echoed through the marble hall. An official, draped in white, stood at her threshold, scroll in hand. His voice was practiced, distant, as he recited the decree. Her late husband's estate, and her body with it, were to pass to his brother, Menon, in accordance with the law of the epikleros. She felt her breath falter. Menon, the man who once joked too long about her beauty at the symposium, whose eyes lingered when his brother's back was turned. Now, by order of the polis, he was to be her husband. Her hands trembled as she reached for the scroll, but the official withdrew it quickly, as if fearing her touch could defy the law itself. Outside, neighbors pretended not to see. The same city that had built temples for wisdom and justice now turned its marble face away from her sorrow. That night, she sat in the dark, listening to the waves beyond the city walls. She imagined her husband's voice among them, calling her name, begging her not to obey. But she knew the truth. Athens had no place for a woman who refused. When dawn came, she lit the hearth again, not in devotion but in defiance, whispering a prayer that the gods might see what the laws of men could not, that she was still a person, even if her city had forgotten it. The Athenian law that sealed Chloris's fate was called the epikleros. To the lawmakers, it was the height of reason, a system that ensured a man's property would never leave his bloodline. To the women who lived beneath it, it was a quiet execution of freedom. Under this law, when a man died without sons, his daughter, or in some cases, his widow, was not granted ownership of his estate. She was granted ownership by someone else. The land, the servants, the olive trees, and even her body became a single inheritance, passed to the nearest male relative like a parcel bound in wax. The philosophers called it balance, the jurists called it order, but the women who whispered in the shadows called it theft. In the courts of Athens, these laws were recited like scripture. The judges, seated in rows of polished stone, quoted Solon and Draco as though they were prophets. They spoke of the sacred duty of kinship, of how women were vessels through which a man's lineage continued, and how society would collapse if a household's wealth were to fall into female hands. Even the priests blessed the custom, invoking the goddess Athena not as a protector of women, but as a guardian of property. It was said that when Athena struck the ground and birthed the olive tree, she did not give it to herself, but to the men who tilled her soil. The irony was not lost on those who worshipped her. Chloris learned the law from Menon himself. He stood before her that evening, dressed in his late brother's himation, the fabric heavy with false dignity. "This is not choice, Chloris," he said, his voice almost gentle. "It is duty." His hand rested on the marble column beside her face, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath. "The city demands it. You are the epikleros. The inheritance must remain whole." The words were meant to sound noble, but they struck her like chains being clasped. She felt her husband's death begin again, not as sickness, but as law. Days passed, and preparations began. The neighbors spoke in tones of pity mixed with relief, for such unions were common. They called it continuing the line, as though lineage could erase love. The servants whispered that she was fortunate that the law spared her from destitution. Yet each time she looked at the seal of Athens stamped upon the marriage decree, she saw the truth beneath its wax. The city that praised liberty had bound her life to another man's greed, and when she walked through the agora, she saw other women draped in mourning veils, each one carrying the same invisible weight, each one condemned to serve democracy's illusion of fairness. The statues of goddesses loomed above them, carved in marble perfection, their lips forever closed, their eyes forever blind to the women who bore their names. The wedding came swiftly, wrapped in the language of duty rather than joy. There was no procession, no laughter, no lyres playing along the narrow streets, only the low murmur of witnesses summoned to legitimize what neither heart nor heaven could bless. Chloris stood at the center of her courtyard, dressed in the same veil she had worn at her husband's funeral. The priest, bored from repetition, recited the sacred words while Menon placed his hand upon her shoulder, claiming both her body and her late brother's estate in one motion. When he spoke her name, she felt it die on his tongue. No one noticed the tremor in her fingers as she lifted the sacrificial barley to the fire. Smoke rose, thin and gray, vanishing into the sunlight like her last breath of freedom. Menon wasted no time establishing his rule. The house that had once smelled of fig wine and myrrh now carried the scent of oil and ink as he signed contracts and called servants by new names. He changed everything, her husband's cloak removed from the wall, his scrolls burned as useless, his memory erased by decree. To the city, Menon was a guardian of tradition. To Chloris, he was a vulture dressed as a citizen. At night, he would sit beside the fire and speak of inheritance, of lands in Marathon and vineyards in Megara, his words spilling with greed as though her silence were consent. She would sit opposite him, her face half lit by the flame, wondering whether the gods saw the difference between devotion and captivity. The first time he entered her chamber, the lamp's wick had nearly burned out. He did not ask permission. The law had already granted it. His hands were rough, his breath heavy with wine. She stared past him, toward the cracked plaster above her head, where the faint shape of an old fresco remained a painted dove, wings spread in faded blue. When he finally slept, she traced the image with her eyes, whispering a prayer that its wings might carry her soul somewhere beyond the reach of men. The house was silent again, except for the faint echo of the city beyond the walls, celebrating democracy while she learned the language of endurance. Morning brought ritual. She rose before dawn to grind grain, to light the hearth, to fill the amphorae with water. The neighbors smiled when they saw her in the courtyard, murmuring that she was adjusting well, that she understood her new place. They called her fortunate to have a protector. Each compliment was a small betrayal, a reminder that her pain was invisible when sanctioned by law. As she watched the sun climb over the Acropolis, her reflection shimmered in the bronze basin at her feet. For a moment she did not recognize the woman staring back, a stranger bound by oaths she never swore, her eyes dimmed but not extinguished. Beneath her breath, she vowed that if the law had stolen her voice, she would learn to speak in silence. The nights in Athens grew long and heavy, filled with the restless hum of crickets and the weight of unspoken prayers. Chloris began to live between shadows, between what was allowed and what was imagined. Menon often returned home late from the agora, his robes stinking of wine and politics, boasting of how he would expand their holdings now that the law had blessed him with both land and widow. She would smile faintly, the kind of smile that hides a storm, and retreat to her chamber once his voice grew loud. There, beneath the faint glow of an oil lamp, she opened her husband's old chest, the only thing Menon had not touched. Inside lay a strip of faded linen, a lock of her husband's hair, and a small bronze tablet engraved with the goddess Demeter's name. She ran her thumb across the cool metal until it trembled. That night, she decided she would no longer pray to the gods of men. When dawn returned, she slipped through the narrow alleys of the city, her black veil drawn close, her sandals muffled by dust. She moved toward the sanctuary of Demeter, where women came not to seek justice but to survive it. The temple was hidden behind a grove of olive trees, its entrance worn smooth by centuries of quiet desperation. Inside, women knelt before flickering lamps, whispering petitions that no magistrate would ever hear. Chloris knelt among them, her voice thin, her words trembling. She did not ask for freedom, only for the strength to endure until the gods remembered her. The priestess, an older woman with gray-streaked hair and the calm eyes of one who had buried every illusion, placed a hand on her shoulder. "The city may own your body," she said softly, "but it cannot own your will. Remember that." Chloris looked up, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something shift inside her, a small, stubborn spark that no decree could extinguish. In the weeks that followed, she visited the temple in secret. There, among widows, barren wives, and women cast aside, she learned what Athens tried to erase. The priestess showed her fragments of forgotten scrolls, remnants of laws older than the city's marble temple's laws, from a time when women could hold land, when lineage was not chained to male descent. Each story was a rebellion whispered into history. Chloris listened as though she were breathing air after drowning. She began to memorize the words, to carry them like weapons hidden beneath her tongue. At home, Menon noticed her silence grow deeper, more composed. He mistook it for submission, never realizing it was preparation. Chloris tended to him as custom required, but her thoughts wandered far beyond the courtyard walls to the sea, to the ports where ships left for distant islands, to the lives that might exist beyond Athens's grip. When she knelt before the hearth that night, the flames reflected in her eyes not as surrender but as promise. Somewhere in the city of gods and men, she had found her first act of defiance, the courage to imagine escape. The moon hung low over the hills of Hymettus when Chloris finally acted on her prayer. The house slept, its corridors silent except for the soft crackle of dying embers. She rose without sound, her veil wrapped tightly, her heartbeat loud enough to drown the world. Each step across the marble floor felt like stepping on her own fear. She paused at the door, glanced once toward the sleeping form of Menon, and felt no pity, only the cold clarity of one who has nothing left to lose. Outside, the air was sharp with salt from the sea. The streets of Athens were empty, save for stray dogs and the faint torchlight of a distant patrol. She slipped into the alleys, her black veil dissolving into shadow. By dawn, she was beyond the city walls. The road to Piraeus wound between olive groves and dry fields where farmers had already begun their day. She walked barefoot to draw less notice, the stones biting her soles, the wind tugging at her cloak. Once, a merchant's cart passed, its driver humming an old hymn. Chloris lowered her head and whispered that same hymn beneath her breath, as if it might disguise her. Each mile carried the weight of both terror and release. Every rustle of leaves could have been a soldier, every shadow, a hand reaching to drag her back. Yet something deeper drove her forward, a quiet voice that told her she was not fleeing life but reclaiming it. By the time she reached the port, the horizon blushed with the first light of morning. Ships creaked in the water, ropes swaying like restless serpents. The docks smelled of salt, sweat, and fish, a world of movement, of destinations unnamed. She hid among the rows of amphorae, wrapping herself in a coarse shawl left by a sleeping slave. A group of merchant women boarded a vessel bound for Aegina, their laughter echoing over the waves. Chloris followed them silently, her steps unsteady, her heart wild. She did not know if the gods would favor her or punish her for defying the law, but for the first time in years, her breath felt like her own. Behind her, Menon awoke to an empty bed. His anger was swift and theatrical. He went to the magistrate, demanded justice, and declared her a runaway wife, forfeiting all property and honor. The officials nodded solemnly, sealing another decree with wax and indifference. A search began, but Athens did not hunt long for those who no longer existed within its laws. Chloris had become invisible. As her ship drifted from the harbor, she looked back once toward the marble city, its temples gleaming under the rising sunday. She thought of her husband, of the life stolen from her, of the women still trapped within those shining walls. The city that claimed to honor wisdom had enslaved half its own. Chloris whispered into the wind, not as a prayer but as a curse. "Let Athens remember me," she said, "not as a wife, but as the law it could not keep." The sea swallowed her words, carrying them into legend. Centuries passed, and the name of Chloris faded into dust, her story swallowed by the marble silence of Athens. The law that bound her, the law of the epikleros, remained etched on tablets and praised by scholars long after the women it condemned were forgotten. It was discovered by chance in the ruins of an old courthouse, carved in steady, confident lines, a relic of reason masking a history of suffering. Historians called it practical, elegant, necessary. They admired how the Athenian system preserved wealth and lineage, rarely asking what it destroyed. But among the broken stones and scattered amphorae, they also found small traces: a bronze pendant bearing the name of Demeter, a woman's sandal buried in the dust of the port. Fragments of a life that refused to vanish completely. Some said it was superstition to connect them, others said it was coincidence. Yet every time the archaeologists brushed the dirt from that pendant, they could feel a defiance pulsing beneath the centuries. Athens still glows in history books as the cradle of democracy, the birthplace of wisdom and philosophy. Tourists walk its streets and marvel at its temples, unaware that beneath their feet once stood the homes of women who lived as shadows beneath marble gods. The philosophers wrote of virtue, the playwrights mocked desire, and the lawmakers spoke of justice. But they built their greatness on the silence of women, like Chloris, widows turned prisoners of lineage, daughters sold as heirs, wives converted into property by decree. Their names were never recorded because the law did not recognize them as worth recording. And yet, though the ink has faded, their pain remains, woven into the same soil that bore the Parthenon. Sometimes, when the wind moves across the ruins of Eleusis, it carries a sound like a woman's whisper. Perhaps it is only the sea brushing the old stones, or perhaps it is the echo of those who once prayed for freedom, carried into the present by time itself. Chloris's story is not an anomaly. It is a mirror held up to the ancient world, a world that could praise wisdom while burying mercy, that could sculpt goddesses from stone while silencing the living women who worshipped them. And though the law has long since turned to dust, its shadow remains in every society that measures a woman's worth by whom she belongs to, rather than who she is. History remembers the names of kings, philosophers, and conquerors, but behind every marble pillar, there were those who paid the price for their perfection. If the world forgets them, it forgets the cost of civilization itself. Remember Chloris, not as a widow, not as a fugitive, but as a voice that refused to die. For every law that once erased a woman's will, there will always be another who finds the courage to speak it back into existence. If this story moved you, subscribe for more forgotten truths the world tried to bury.